Hey there, I'm Darren Steele, and this is the Think Queerly podcast with a bit of an update. You make a real difference in the world every time that you stand up courageously and proudly for what you know is right by ethically supporting a common humanity of dignity and equity. Now, why is that important? Well, first, let me go back so that I can go forward. I haven't done a podcast on Think Queerly for a year and a half. In effect, in truth, I closed it reluctantly based on circumstances and being very busy in my life at the time and changing careers. And I made the choice. I didn't have the intellectual capacity to do Think Queerly in the way that I was used to, that I felt would be empowering and I thought would be interesting and useful for the listener. Now, here we are. I'm recording this on Tuesday, July 30th, 2024. I don't know if I'm going to continue with Think Queerly as a regular podcast, but I feel I need to at least bring a few episodes in a time that is very challenging and it's very important, at least in how I think and what I want to share, to engage creatively, playfully, curiously with those of you who have the wisdom and the leadership that someone somewhere needs right now to make a difference in the world, specifically for the rights, the freedoms of 2S LGBTQIA plus people. Now, I'm titling this talk, this video, this podcast, Is History Repeating? What the Rise of Fascism and Dictators Can Tell Us About How to Act Right Now. I don't want to get too much into the nitty gritty of what all of these things are. I actually want to share with you some things I've been listening to, some things I've been watching as an alternative way to just reading the news and getting upset and wondering, what can we do? Now, it doesn't matter whether you're queer, straight, lesbian, gay, trans. If you think that every person is equal in the sense of this person is just as equally deserving of human dignity as this next person, if you believe that we are all on the same level playing field in the sense of if I'm human and you're human, there's no need to distinguish who's a better human, who is a more deserving human, who should have rights and who shouldn't have rights. If you believe that, then this episode is most definitely for you. Now, it's going to focus on historical queer issues and how queer and trans people have been prejudiced against, have been killed, have been murdered, have been sent to concentration camps. And I want to draw a parallel to the modern world today. Conversion therapy isn't quite a concentration camp, but I would argue perhaps in another episode that it is something close to the modern equivalent. But it's the next step should the rise of Christofascism take over in the United States and where I live in Canada, if the capital C conservatives that are really carefully watching what is happening in the United States, whether they can adopt and continue to spread their prejudice, their hatred, their agenda, and their ideology of what they believe gender is. So, okay, I could talk about gender. I could talk about ideology. I could talk about right and wrong. I can talk about why it's important to stand up for these things. I could do all of those things. But I actually want to invite you to listen to one or two key podcasts and to watch one or two documentaries to open your mind to what has happened in the past and the horrors of what has happened in the past. And to imagine you're reading a book of fiction. Do you, and let me ask you a question. Do you have a favorite fiction author or favorite book? I Felice Picano is my favorite author of all time. I feel magically transported when I read his books. I have I guess, a very vivid imagination, and Felice Picano does the most incredible job with painting pictures with his words, and I see them and I just get lost in the imagination and the fantasy and the creating of these pictures in my mind. And likewise, when I read really good historical details, accounts of what had happened in different situations in the world, whatever they may be, I try to imagine what was it like visually and viscerally and emotionally. So let me start with El Dorado. Everything the Nazis Hate, which is a documentary on Netflix that basically talks about El Dorado, or centers on the nightclub El Dorado, which was the big nightclub in the 20s and in the 30s in Berlin, when Berlin's nightlife for queer and trans people was unlike anything that we've seen or that we see today. Yes, we have queer and trans and gay and lesbian nightclubs and spaces, and we have prides and such. But it was a time of uniqueness that was eradicated by the Nazis. And because it was so many decades before certain queer rights began to happen again in Germany, what was lost has been lost forever. The culture was completely eradicated. So all that we have now are written documents or the few survivors from that time who were interviewed or who wrote diaries and were researched by historians for this documentary. So what's important is to observe that we have always been here. All of us as humans have always been here. All of us as humans have been expressing desire in different ways. And I'm talking about desire in the sense of attraction, physically, emotionally, intellectually, for other human beings. Let's think of this for a moment. Desire is physical, emotional, and intellectual. Now, I am of the belief that it doesn't matter who the person is whom you desire. Because for me to be fully expressive and creative and thoughtful and aware of what brings me joy and happiness in life, then why should I be inhibited by the rest of society that tells me you can only love this kind of a person? You can only desire this kind of a person. When we just think of it in that way, how is that logical? Well, someone has decided trying to use logic to set up a framework of right and wrong and to create rules and regulations, which is actually very much the logical part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex that's deciding here's how things should work, here's how I'm going to set up things to make sure that they happen in this way and not in that way. But our feelings, our emotions are not logical. Those come from other parts of our brains or of our brains. They come from other parts of our brain. We have a more emotional part of the brain that is seeking safety and comfort and belonging and acceptance. We have the most ancient part of the brain, the reptilian part of the brain is one word for it, that is making sure that we're safe. It's on the lookout for danger of physical kinds that could kill us or harm us in some way. And in our modern society, that part of the brain is actually reacting to the stresses that we experience in everyday life. And one of the biggest stresses in our everyday lives as queer and trans people is the ever increasing attacks on the rights and freedoms that we've gained to this point, which are not secure because we have a potential president in the United States who's saying he is going to do away with all of these rights, not just for queer and trans people, but for women and for anyone else who is not a Christian and for anyone else who is not an evangelical, probably dominionist type Christian, because if you're not with that group, you are wrong and you are not deserving and you need to be pushed out or, at worst, eliminated. And if you hear any funny noises in the background, it's my dog dreaming. So that's why it's really important that we look at these documentaries and get, I know it's kind of like wordplay here, that we get creative, we get playful in our mind and imagine what was it like to have those freedoms in the 20s in Berlin? And then what was it like to suddenly be kicked out of those spaces? The bar was closed down. The El Dorado bar then became actually a recruitment office for the Nazis. Talk about a slap in the face. And then people were trying to flee the country for safety. That's when the book burning started. The Magnus Hirschfeld Institute, I forget exactly what it was called, but it was researching sexuality and gender. That's where there were the first actual transition surgeries for people that wanted to transition. The entire library was sacked, destroyed, and burned. Now, when I say history repeating, that's why I say is history repeating with a question mark, because history doesn't repeat, but certainly patterns, maybe ways of thinking begin to repeat. We see things that have happened in the past and we think, but that's in the past, that can't happen again. But elements of Nazism, of fascism, are coming into play. There was definitely a strong religious focus in Nazism that modern language is calling Christo-fascism today, because that's precisely what it is. What's happening in the United States is that a group of people have decided that the supreme ruler is what they call God, and that the only way they can have the society they believe is the only just and reasonable society is the society that comes from these words in texts that were found in caves in the Middle East, and that these are somehow true, and they have to overthrow government, they have to take everyone's rights away, and they have to impose a dictatorship where there is no more voting democracy. If that sounds reasonable to you, you should not be sitting still. But how do you not sit still? How do you as one person make a difference? Well, you as one person all by yourself are probably not going to make a difference. But if you can bring your efforts to an organization or an advocacy group, or if you can start something and use your skills, your wisdom, your guidance, and lead others who are looking for someone to follow and join in the cause, then this is how you can show up and be the difference, to be the change, by inspiring others to follow your lead. One of the things that I have been interested in or trying to understand has shown up in another couple of places. There is a podcast called LGBTQ and A, It's an interview with Mark Siegel. Now, Mark Siegel was there way back at the beginning, at the start of Stonewall, became very active with the Gay Liberation Front and being an advocate and an activist very early on in the United States. It's a really interesting interview. I'm going to have the links for all of these things in my show notes. But what's most interesting is he talks about using playfulness and silliness because that is a way of disrupting this seriousness. And I'm not diminishing what's happening right now by saying this seriousness, but when you can take people off guard that are highly prejudiced, you can tap into, you can touch their humanity. If you can make someone who is against you laugh or for a moment feel uncomfortable, they're getting in tune with an essence of who they are, which is just an opening of the door of approachability. One of the things that Mark Siegel mentions in this podcast, is that he can't believe that people are not protesting to the extent of showing up outside people's doors and front lawns like what they used to do in the 80s, I think it was, depending on what's said in this particular interview, and actually face on talk to the people who are part of the problem, but who are also the people who can change their mind and make a difference and change the course of what is prejudiced or anti-queer or anti-trans legislation in governments. People, I think, right now are very afraid. They're very afraid of the rise of the far right. They're very afraid that the far right is armed. They're very afraid of the rhetoric that's showing up. But this is a moment in time where we have to balance out fear with inaction. It's a question that I think we need to ask ourselves repeatedly. Am I doing enough? Am I doing what I am capable of? Am I helping in a way that's going to make a difference that will help me be as human as the next human being? There's an interview that I did with Tim McCaskill way back when. Let's see if I can find the date of that. Well, it doesn't matter. April 2022. He's the author of Queer Progress from Homophobia to Homonationalism. It's a book that focuses very much on Canadian history. But what's important about that is to take from it the on the ground activism that happened, the marches, the protests, the letter writing. There's a lot of organization right now that happens behind closed doors, in boardrooms, on Zoom calls. And that's important. But there's also the importance of on the ground visibility that might not be as powerful right now as it could be. It's showing up more and more in different areas of what's going on in the world right now. But one more thought. One of the reasons in Canada, at least in Toronto, that some of the changes to anti-gay, anti-queer legislation were changed is because gay rights groups were able to partner with other rights groups. Off the top of my head, I don't remember them all. But the more groups that work together that are essentially fighting for the same thing, if this is about freedoms, freedom from prejudice, freedom from discrimination, there are more than one single group of people that are standing up for that. There are always going to be the different things that everybody wants unique to their tribe, to their group. but for the greater good, for the common humanity to which we all belong. This is a time where we have to build more bridges with people who, as I said earlier on in the beginning of this episode, who see each of us as equally deserving human beings that should be and need to be and are inherently the same as human, meaning I am no better than any other human being. I, as a human being, deserve nothing more with respect to rights or privileges than any other human being. And that's what connects us all. So I've got a few more links that I will reference in the show notes. There's a great podcast out of Canada called the Resurrection Podcast. Season 2 is about heroes of the early years around the HIV/AIDS crisis. There is The Village, which has 3 seasons and is a CBC podcast that season 2 or season 3 looks at police brutality in Montreal and also in Toronto in the 80s and how that all changed. And finally, Paragraph 175, a documentary out of Germany, I think about almost 20 years ago, that deals with Paragraph 175, which was the anti-gay law that was used, referring back to the El Dorado Netflix documentary, to imprison and send gay people to concentration camps. This documentary interviewed some of the surviving people whose lives were ruined by Paragraph 175, and it's a moving documentary. Again, I invite you to watch these to see how people have been treated in the past and the danger of how we could be treated in the future. And it could even be worse. Ending on a high note, I hope that this sharing, this discussion, this thinking about how we think, this thinking about how we can imagine and put ourselves into these documentary type situations of what was it like then, to imagine how it felt, to imagine how it felt, to imagine how it felt, to imagine what it looked like, and to imagine how it felt, as perhaps a motivation to consider what it is you can do and want to do to stand up for what you know to be true and right and make a difference and inspire others to follow your lead. I'm Darren Steele, and thank you so much for watching or listening, and perhaps we'll see each other again soon. Bye for now.